Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast. Today's entrepreneurs are mental athletes that have to know about the mind and how to keep it fit. Our goal is to increase our resilience against stress and anxiety, optimize our productivity, motivation, and optimism by learning about the human mind through psychology, neuroscience, and human behavior. I'm your host Ozan. I'm a founder who has experienced the challenges of launching and growing a business and a keen student of human behavior over the last 15 years. I'll share with you what I know and learn. Hundreds of impactful, behavior-changing ideas are waiting to be discovered by us. Let's begin now. Learning and memory. So it is very similar in our analogy to cardio training. Why is that similar? So the first idea is it is very similar because it is the lifeblood of the mind. Without learning and memory, it is impossible to make decisions, problem solve, or to understand the more complex world around us. We crunch, remix, recombine information in novel and different ways to make meaning out of them and to create value. And this is especially true for entrepreneurs and anybody in a creative endeavor, really. So we don't just store factual information. In fact, we are not very good at it. Our true power comes from our capacity to conceptualize and construct new relationships between otherwise unrelated bits and pieces of information. So every other important idea is a tool in our toolbox. And the more tools we have, the bigger the range of solutions we can produce to the problems we are trying to solve. That is the specific reason why this is important. So in a physical training scenario, if you were to do some cardio training, you would potentially do longer distance runs, swim, cycle, or anything that will get your heart rate up and keep it there for a sustained period of time, really. What would be the equivalent of this for mental fitness? I think this is the question that's worth answering. So when I look at learning, I see four core areas that could potentially be useful in optimizing our learning and increasing our effectiveness at that. The first one is the concept of a semantic tree of knowledge. This is quite interesting because this is a concept that I'm a fan of. I studied psychology and sociology, and I loved these fields because they're very useful trunks of knowledge. If we imagine this semantic tree of knowledge as a tree with a trunk with some big branches and then some smaller branches, it actually makes a lot of sense. And sociology and psychology are especially useful in understanding the bigger world and seeing the relationships between different things. As in the context of, for example, how a society works, you would have to understand how businesses work, how politics work, how groups of information, groups of people come together and process information. And as a concept, Yuval Harari mentions we have a tendency to share some myths, to have some common shared myths, and through those we can actually act as individuals of a society. And it is very similar in the domain of psychology as well. For example, understanding personality psychology, what extroversion is, what introversion is, understanding the power of belonging to a group, understanding the difference, as Daniel Kahneman put it in the book Thinking Fast and Slow, the difference between the remembering self and the experiencing self. So these are very strong heuristics almost to build that trunk of that tree. And once you learn new information, you can actually hang those bits and pieces of information on the branches of those trees. Of those trees, essentially, and it turns into a forest with the trees connected down below, so which is quite a rich analogy there. Today I was browsing Twitter, and an update from a friend of mine showed me a post that was from a Reddit AMA, and it was answered by Elon Musk. And in that, they ask him, how do you learn so much and so fast? And the bit of advice he gives is really fantastic. It is spot on, and it very much aligns with the theme here. He talks about that semantic tree as well. What he says is, quote, make sure you understand the fundamental principles, the trunk and the big branches, before you get into the leaves, details, or there is nothing for them to hang on to, end quote. And I mean, I 100% agree with this, and I have experienced the value of this as well. So the first idea, again, going back to our analogy of cardio training for learning, is having a semantic tree of knowledge and growing that tree of knowledge throughout your life. The second part of that is having mental models, again, as those big branches in the trees. And Farnham Street is a good resource for that. If you Google Farnham Street and mental models, the first page that comes up will be very useful. And it really elevates our understanding of the world, and it makes it much cognitively easier. So that was the two parts of the first idea, having a semantic tree of knowledge for 4 core ideas to optimize learning. The second one is actually listening and following your genuine curiosity in pursuit of new information. This is a theme that I think is deceptively simple but overlooked by many. Imagine a situation where you're facing a crisis and you're trying to make sense of the world. Now, at that time, it is quite difficult, almost impossible, to concentrate on something that has no tangible benefit to your understanding of that crisis. And my recommendation here is, and this is something that I make use of as well, actually reflect for a moment and try to unearth what it is that I'm actually curious about, what it is that my brain is trying to process at that stage. And once I have found that, I look for resources, books that have a connection to that. For example, the COVID situation, it is a new reality for the world, and it's a radical time of change. So rather than reading a novel or a non-fiction book that has no connection points essentially to this crisis that's going on, I would go and try to pick something, a book, a non-fiction book, or if I'm listening and learning through a podcast or anything really that has a strong established common theme with the current situation I'm in. So it is actually a way of assisting your brain and following that curiosity that you momentarily have. And this can also be expanded into a bigger idea as well. Reflecting and asking what you are genuinely curious about is actually one of the best ways to make sure you can concentrate for longer periods of time, and that concentration actually results in high quality learning. The third idea here is to learn socially, learn with real human connection. The third idea really is to learn socially, to learn through real human connection. We are social beings, and this core idea is actually where psychology, which looks at the individual at the atomistic level, versus sociology, which looks at the group. This is the meeting point of these two disciplines that have dedicated themselves to the understanding of the human condition. We are social beings. We have this huge innate tendency to look for confirmation points within the groups that we are in. We always compare ourselves to other people. So this by itself is not the most positive of the traits that we have, but it also has a very positive dimension in which we want to share, we want to look at what other people are doing. So what I mean by learning socially is actually talking with people, asking them questions, and have some learning partners, learning buddies that share your genuine intellectual and business curiosities, and have them on as thought partners, as learning partners, and take them along for the ride. And it is not a short ride either. Understanding the basics of entrepreneurship takes at least a few years. So I think this is a key theme here. And the fourth one is learning by teaching. When we try to teach something, it is just this magical process that helps us really crystallize the core pillars of those ideas and find impactful ways through analogies, through examples, through stories to actually communicate those ideas. And because we are beings that learn through stories, the construction process, the creative process of coming up with narratives and making sure those ideas make sense and work seamlessly with each other is actually a very good learning tool as well. Now, a way of learning through teaching is having somebody sit across you and trying to teach them something, which is not always the ideal scenario, or it's very easy to facilitate. But another way of doing that is actually creating content in the form of writing a blog, recording a podcast as I'm doing right now, composing a few tweets, or even writing a book. All of these have the potential side benefit of actually being bits and pieces of content that allows people to get to know you, and it might very well contribute to your first personal brand. But the most important thing is here, by doing this, the reward is within the action itself. You will have learned much better by doing this. Now, one part of this core cardio training, in the going back to the original analogy, was learning, and the other bit is memory. And it has actually three key pillars as I conceptualize. I'm sure there are others, but I think these three are the most important ones, and that I use daily as well. The first one is the idea of emotional stimulation. So when we look at the human brain and how it actually stores information, we see a strong correlation between the amount of emotional activation and retained knowledge. So just for the sake of the argument, imagine you are back to being a student and listening to a boring lecture, and you try to make the best effort to actually learn because you have an exam coming up, but you genuinely do not care that much about the subject. You're not passionate about it. It really doesn't give you the goosebumps. And contrast that with another topic which you're really curious about, which you're genuinely excited by. In that scenario, imagine this is learning about different music bands or different video games that will come up again in conversations with friends, and that will actually contribute hugely to you becoming a more popular figure among your friends. Now, because of the reward mechanisms involved in this, emotions are much more engaged, which means you will actually store a bigger chunk of those informations processed. And I remember this from my personal experiences as well. I studied psychology and sociology as I loved these disciplines, and I realized I retained a very huge percentage of what I learned in the classroom. And I think that was mostly due to the fact that whenever I had encountered an interesting idea, it would give me the goosebumps. It would actually stimulate me emotionally, and that is your brain lighting up. And when that activation in the brain happens, you store more of that information. So make sure you actually follow your genuine curiosity and seek areas, like reflect back and try to observe under which conditions and what type of knowledge actually gives you the goosebumps, stimulates you emotionally. You'll remember a bigger percentage of those. And this is, of course, a huge advantage. Imagine you're an entrepreneur who is really excited by learning about these things. You'll have a huge edge over the people who are just trying to learn that for the functional value of that information, for the functional value of it, and then try to adapt it. It's going to be much more difficult in that case. The second idea, the second core pillar of the cardio study, the cardio for memory, is actually revisit and recall. The human mind is quite interesting. We actually store memories, childhood memories. When we recall them, we change them in ever so slight ways. And when they are restored in different ways. What this proves is whenever we recall and revisit a memory, we actually rewrite it in some ways. So the very act of remembering something is a creative process for the brain. And I think this is worth emphasizing. Whenever you remember something, it is actually a creative process in the brain. So the act of remembering, revisiting them is a very good way to boost the memory, the learning on a specific topic. And the best way to do that is to apply it, to actually learn through experience. Imagine you're learning about content marketing and you're discovering key ideas, and all of a sudden you discover the immensely important idea that community building is the most important part of actually building an audience. Creating content goes hand in hand with that, but you really understand the importance of community building. If you do not go out there and create content and try to build a community, your learning will be stifled at a different level. The third idea here is sleep. Sleep is an important and often misunderstood or understood, but there's a limited understanding of the real functional value of sleep and its importance. So when we sleep, we go through a restorative process. And in that process, actually, what has been learned goes into the long-term storage. It actually becomes a part of your long-term storage, long-term memory. And the efficiency of that sleep is in direct correlation with that. A really interesting idea. When we sleep, we process information in such a way. People who are unable to sleep after they have suffered a certain traumatic incident are actually unable to differentiate or rather compartmentalize the emotional impact of a traumatic situation against the memory of it. People who are able to sleep well and actually dream about the traumatic experiences they had are much better able to remember the event without recalling all the negative information that comes with that event. Hence, they overcome their trauma. So sleep has these incredible powers. Sleeping 8 hours a day or 7, but not under that. Making sure your sleep quality is high, so limiting your caffeine consumption in the later hours of the day. And utilizing the most important aspect of sleep, which is huge concentration potential and huge memory retention potential during the early hours of the day. So remember, if you can dedicate the earlier hours of the day to learning and important problem-solving tasks, and not spend those valuable hours with unpleasant emails or social media, you will have a much better chance actually in retaining that. So just to revise, I think there's a huge correlation between how we train train our body in terms of cardio training and learning and memory. And these were some of the key ideas: having a semantic tree of knowledge, using mental models, listening to your genuine intellectual curiosity in the pursuit of new information, learning socially and interacting with people and having learning buddies, learning through teaching or creating content. And when it comes to memory, making sure you follow emotionally stimulating bits of information, revisit, recall, ideally by applying, and make good use of sleep. If this content is for you, make sure to follow us. Take care.